It's my great pleasure to introduce Elsa. She is one of these rock star professors, and I can't wait for another couple years until I'm old enough that I can get in on the audit program from NC State and audit your class. Ashley and Matt have taken her class. Matt's actually in your class right now, and Matt's just like all of Twitter about this class. And Ashley won't stop talking about this. So we're in for a real treat. And as you all saw, wonderful readings. Now, I won't embarrass you, right? But we all did all the readings, right? Nod your head, everybody. Look like you're, yeah, we're on this, right? Okay, we all did all the readings. I did all the readings, and they're great, right? So we learned so much, a lot of information taken. So I babbled on long enough. Let me turn it over to you. Okay.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much. Way to build it up.
Yes.
Thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning. So I think by way of introduction, thank you, Lise, for the introduction. I'll tell you just a little bit more about kind of where I came from and how I came to be an urban ecologist that I am now, which was not through a path of urban ecology. I actually went to grad school and studied chemical ecology and insects. My PhD project was deep in the forests of Peru, as far from a city as I could get. My master's project was in the swamps of Wisconsin. And then I left science entirely and became a science writer and editor, worked as a podcaster, worked for American Scientist and PRI's The World, and then got kind of bummed out sitting behind a desk and a microphone talking about other people's science, and so I started looking for postdocs, and the one I found happened to be in a lab that studied urban ecology, and I haven't stopped. It wasn't a thing I was looking for, but I kind of landed in a place that felt useful at the right time. And so now I run an urban ecology lab at NC State University. My lab mostly studies insects, including bees, ants, and butterflies in urban and developed environments. We're especially interested in thermal ecology of these insects, how they cope with urban warming, how they thermoregulate or adapt to warming. And also, in my sort of biodiversity and conservation realm, we're interested in sort of which insects are living in the city, how many, and how do they actually move around. That's the tough nut we're trying to crack right now, is like, what's actually a barrier to movement? What facilitates it? If you're a bee trying to get around town. And then I also have a 30% extension appointment where I work mostly with master gardeners, maybe master naturalists like you, in the area of sort of pollinator conservation and habitat in urban areas. So these are just some of the fun tools and organisms that we use in our studies, some of the places that we work. And then my last thing is I also teach this urban ecology class every fall. And it's these kind of last two things that I think converged to get me here. And I have to admit, I was telling Ashley earlier, like I kind of struggled with how to structure these 3 hours. Like it feels like a long time to just sit here. But at the same time, like if we were doing BID, I'd bring all kinds of specimens and activities, but like urban ecology is kind of the thing that either you take many days and weeks to go out and measure some subtle phenomenon that you couldn't just see, or you sit around and talk about it and think about it and adjust the way you think about nature. So I landed on a pretty sedentary plan. Drink your coffee, brace yourselves. We will talk among each other some, but there's gonna be a lot of talking. But I'm gonna break it up into 8 segments, hopefully sort of 10 to 25 minutes apiece, starting with, and one of those segments is a break. I assume we're going to all need to get up at some point. So we'll start with kind of an introduction to the built environment and its like short history on the planet. At this point, more than half of humans live in cities. More people live in cities now than were alive on the entire planet in 1974, period. We don't really know the percent. It's more than half. It might be 57 according to the United Nations. It might be 78% according to some other methods. Everybody defines urban a little bit differently. Because of course cities are sort of a continuum from dense downtowns to suburbs and then smaller towns. So who do you actually count? But definitely we can say unequivocally more than half of us are living in built environments in places where the economy is not just agricultural. But even though this is the dominant human habitat now, it's really brand new on the face of the earth. This also much less urban than the one I just showed you, but still an urban built environment, also brand new on the planet. And that's what I'm showing you here in this timeline that covers the past 12,000 years of human history. So the lines here, and wow, the colors are completely identical in this projection. But this one is the world, and then this one is the United States, just because that's where we are. And the thing that line is showing you is the percent of humans that live in urban areas, and the horizontal axis is time, starting 12,000 years ago up until the year 2000. And so the point here is that humans were not urban for a very long time, and in fact, this axis could really go out the street, like across the street, because like anatomically modern humans have been on the planet for like 300,000 years, behaviorally modern humans about 50,000 years, behaviorally modern meaning, you know, we're starting to do abstract things and make art and ornaments. But this timeline starts in the year 12,000 years ago, when people sort of started doing agriculture, created a way of making a living that didn't require them to move around all the time. So that was the earliest relevant date that we could have possibly become sedentary, made a town, stayed in it year-round, long-term. But we didn't yet. So agriculture started there, and it was a few thousand years before the first sort of urbanish settlements started to show up. According to sort of what we know from archaeology, around 4,000, sort of 3,000 to 4,000 BC is when the first cities started to appear, defined in terms of, you know, having a dense population that had non-agricultural activities supporting their economy. They started to have a more organized, sort of complex hierarchical social structure, and they started to have sort of a service economy and other types of jobs. And so this first happened in Mesopotamia, and then, I mean, it was still a fairly agricultural situation, but it was starting the transition. But then on the x-axis here, we're still, we can't really see any urbanization in terms of like percent of the population. By the time of the peak Roman Empire, which we think of as having been a lot of people and having built significant infrastructure throughout much of Europe, still less than 5% of humans living in cities. We'll zoom in on these past 2,000 years so we can see a little more clearly. And we'll keep going. We've got the peak Byzantine Empire, still barely urban, not a big change. The Middle Ages in Europe, not a big change. Peak Inca Empire in the New World, in South America, still not a big change. When things really kick off here is the Industrial Revolution. Around sort of 1760 to 1840, when we figure out how to tap into fossil fuels and mechanize things and have machines do work that people used to do, frees up a whole lot of human time to come into cities and do other types of work, non-agricultural work. And that's when urbanization takes off in Europe and then in the US with a little lag time. And so now what I actually want to show you is a little animation that shows the same thing, only it shows it geographically. So before I start it, just to get oriented, it's going to tell you the year over here. Cities are going to pop up when they, not when they're actually first founded, but when, according to sort of historians' best guesses based on archaeology and things like old, historical records of, how many soldiers did they pay, and therefore how many people must have been in the town, or how many loaves of bread changed hands in this economy. They're like guessing how many people must have lived in the city. So when that number crossed 40,000, the city goes on the map. And it comes up as a bright dot, and then it kind of fades to yellow, and then the yellow turns more and more red the bigger the city gets. And then it'll occasionally show you like a sort of key historical event there.
Could I just ask what the colorization of the maps indicates?
The color of the background is showing kind of the vegetation. Like this is sort of a satellite view of the planet. So you've got forested areas and then more desert areas that are lighter, or sort of like steppe areas that are not vegetated. And then of course ice at the poles. All right, so let's see. Oh, I wonder if I'm actually online. Is this going to work? I didn't think about getting that queued up in all of the time that I was standing here. Hold on. We could also skip the animation, but let me just see. Well, I think I'm going to give up on it, but I'll fiddle with it during the break, and if it comes back up, we'll look at it later. All right. So, alas, you were stuck with only the static timelines. But the sort of overall point is that, you know, cities are incredibly new to life on Earth and to the humans that live in them. This is a brand new environment, and it was mainly triggered by the Industrial Revolution. So that's kind of our setup, that's our intro. And then section 2 is a question that we're probably not going to fully answer, but it's, you know, are cities actually natural? Are they unnatural? What are they? How do we think about them? Because that's been a big influence on kind of the course of how science studies cities, how ecology has been arrived only belatedly in cities. And here you had a couple of readings that address this issue of kind of how we relate emotionally to urban and non-urban environments and how that maybe influences our view of, you know, whether they are natural, whether there is anything worth conserving in them, and what might be the benefits of doing so if we did. So this was, in case you didn't get your readings, just as kind of as background, this is from a book by William Cronon, who is an environmental scientist and historian, retired fairly recently, but wrote this book and the chapter that you had in 1990. And then this is a more recent paper. It was published in 2016. They're still publishing on the same topic, similar ideas, by ecologists from Japan and the UK, talking about the extinction of experience, which explores this idea that lack of exposure to nature, whatever we believe that is, sort of becomes a vicious circle where we cease to value it, cease to look for it, and then when we do that, we have even fewer opportunities to encounter it and start neglecting the natural, sort of non-built world. So questions I have for you to kind of think about your perceptions of the human environment, the built environment, just sort of like individually first and then maybe compare notes with each other. Did you grow up in the city, the country, somewhere else, and how did you develop your own concept of what's urban versus natural or something else? Or are those even, is that even a dichotomy? And then from the readings, if you did have a chance to do them, what are some of the viewpoints in those that kind of stood out to you about the relationship between cities and nature? Did any of them resonate or frustrate you? And how do those match up to your own viewpoints? And then last, what is the extinction of experience? Maybe I already gave that one away. And any surprises for you in that paper? And if you didn't have the chance to read it, no worries, you can think about the other ones. So let's just take like 3 minutes to kind of jot down some notes about your own perception of built environments, and then you'll compare for a minute or two with somebody next to you, and then we'll talk a little bit as a group, and then we'll keep going. Rather than jinx it, I'm gonna see about playing this, and then we'll discuss, finish discussing the questions. So it's starting, back at 3600 BC. You're going to see the first cities popping up over here in Mesopotamia.
And you said there had to be 40,000 people over the
Yeah. So there are some like famous Central and South American cities that just like never appear because they weren't actually that big, even though they were like historically and culturally super important. So it takes about 3 minutes for it to make it up to the year 2000.
This is cool.
And the population estimates are based on like oldish data sets from like the 1970s and 80s that some historians worked out, like with their sort of quirky estimates. But then the new thing was in maybe 2016 or so. Some environmental scientists sort of pulled those old data sets out of like old books and just like and digitized them, like typed them all into a spreadsheet, and then figured out the the coordinates for them all so they could actually put them on a map. And then people can make things like this out of it.
Oh, wow. Here's Alexander the Great.
It's picking up.
But there are those cities in South America. I mean, well, in Central America.
Yeah.
Did-
There's this one.
But those,
urban-
but those popped up,
Yeah, they popped up.
when Alexander the Great had his empire, so did he go there?
No, those were like indigenous cultures making cities, just completely independently of European urbanization
Wow.
at the time.
Europe's going gangbusters now.
And we're still only at 1100, so like on the graph that I showed you of like the percent of humans who are urban, it's still like tiny. There's a lot of cities popping up, but most people aren't in them.
Oh, there we go. Oh,
1850, so now we're
Oh. I wonder the toilets are back.
And there we are. All right.
That
Well,
is.
Thanks for your patience with that. Glad it finally worked. So, back to what we were doing. So you had a few minutes to kind of reflect on some of, your relationship with cities. And then I'm just gonna be honest, these are questions we also use in my urban ecology class at State. Usually they're homework questions and we talk about them in class, but let's try just talking about them in class, compare notes, especially kind of what stood out to you about the readings if you read them. And so just get with somebody kind of near you. Yes.
Can I just ask a quick question
Yeah.
about the animation? Maybe you mentioned about what point was the population, like how much was it when it was like indicated on the map?
Yeah, it first popped up when it was 40,000 people.
Okay.
So, yeah.
It looked like St. Louis was the first city in the US. Is that?
Did it?
Yeah, they make Cahokia.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, but still,
It-
I do early American history and it was Cahokia.
It was what?
Thanks.
Cahokia.
Yeah,
Okay.
I missed that spot, but good eye. Thank you.
Where is Cahokia?
It's East St. Louis today.
Oh, East St.
Yeah,
Louis?
south.
St. Louis basically built on top of it, right?
Right on the East St. Louis.
But that was the first real city in America, in North America, was East St. Louis?
It was the largest first early one, starts around 1850.
But it was an indigenous city at that point, not a
It
European
was,
settler
it
city.
was, right, indigenous
Yeah.
Americans, okay,
All right. Do y'all want to talk about this stuff, or do you want to just like go whole group with it? Not seeing a lot of like diving into conversations with your neighbors, so maybe we just keep rolling.
Okay. I'll just
Yeah.
offer one quick thing. I don't know
Great.
if anybody else had this experience, but I grew up in a small suburb on Long Island. I don't know if you know Long Island, the South Shore, it's where Fire Island is and everything. And so we had a lot of exposure. It was just a quiet suburb, and the beach was right across the bay, and so we spent our summers there. And that all seemed very familiar and lovely. Every spring we knew we could go pick wild blueberries and that sort of thing, the same plants. But my mother would take us into the city to go to the museum all the time, and the city frightened me when I was young, and I wonder if anybody else had that experience, because it just seemed very gray, and it seemed huge, and the scale really made me feel insignificant. And I was terrified that if something happened to my mother, we would just be lying dead in the street, because you know, like that scene from Midnight Cowboy where there's somebody dead in front of Tiffany's and the people just kind of, you know, it's like that, you know what I mean? It just feels so anonymous, but I always felt that if it was in my hometown, people would rush over to help.
Mm-hmm. Did other people have early experiences of cities that felt particularly, I don't know, intimidating or welcoming or something else back in the back?
I've never been a lot of different places and like environments and stuff, and I don't really have. I never had a clear definition between like what was like natural nature and what was a city, because it was kind of all like nature to me growing up was all just part of everything. Like you can see it everywhere, kind of thing. So that is my experience. Like nature as a whole is one thing, and then what we do within it is part of what we're doing. Like it's still part of nature.
Yeah.
So that was my experience growing up, and then just now I do a lot of urban, urban gardening, urban nature for youth and adults. But and I have that extinction of experience thing, and the thing that I notice a lot, especially in cities where like I'm teaching or working with groups, where there's like this overwhelming fear of anything natural, and you see it in like the valuing of like built things and crafts and stuff like that, that need for industrialization of like making things better, it seems. And so people are really, I feel like there's a lot of fear with the natural world when people don't grow up specifically in it or understanding that it kind of is everywhere.
Yeah. So I think two really interesting things there. One is kind of that perspective that, you know, cities are nature. They're just like another beaver dam or ant mound or something. And then also the fascinating contrast between like the, you know, the students or the youth that you work with who are maybe used to the city and
Yeah.
find the nature frightening, and then your
Yeah.
experience of the exact opposite. So all of this is like, yeah, very colored by what we're used to growing up. Does anybody have other perspectives either on, yeah?
It felt like to me growing up in suburbia that you had to go somewhere for nature. You either had to go somewhere to find a hike, or you go to camp, or, you know, which is sort of in the woods, or, you know, but it didn't feel like I was looking at nature kind of all around me, and so I guess that's my observation.
Yep. And I think that's, I mean, it's definitely not universal, but I feel like in sort of US culture of like, I don't know, the past few generations and the ones upcoming, like that's a very common perception. It's like nature is where you go away from the people and you go see some place that's like less developed, that doesn't have people living in it. And then one of your readings are kind of trying to make the argument that we are more the beaver dam, the ant mound, like we are part of nature, and it would probably be to our benefit and to the benefit of nature if we would perceive these sort of built spaces as part of nature and value them more so. In fact, kind of along with the extinction of experience idea, there's another reading, I think I didn't give it to you, but it calls its idea the pigeon paradox, where it argues that, you know, if we go around devaluing urban nature, the pigeons and the non-native ants and the possums and the raccoons, that people who grow up with those as their only experience of nature are going to further devalue nature and not have that sense of connection with it, and not be sort of motivated, you know, conservation motivated voters or actors. Which, if that's an agreed upon desirable goal, then like we all kind of maybe should try and see urban nature as part of nature. Yes.
So for the context of this conversation, how do you know when you're in the city? What defines the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one that I spent quite a bit of time on in class and took out for this one. And you kind of don't, because it is a continuum, right? From, you know, denser, taller built areas to outlying areas, and where exactly do you draw the line across that? Which is why I gave those two vastly different estimates in the beginning of like maybe we're half urban, maybe we're 78% urban. The 54% is the UN's estimate, just by adding up every individual country's own definition of urban, which can vary from anything from like 100 dwellings, period, to like at least 50,000 people in a contiguous area of this much and a non-agricultural economy. So different countries define urban differently themselves, and then the UN sort of throws all that in one spreadsheet and adds it up. The 78% number comes from attempts to use satellite imagery kind of overlaid with census data to come up with a uniform definition applicable across the whole planet, and they've been people into sort of, you know, urban centers, urban clusters that include things that we would recognize as suburbs. But it's not clear that a uniform definition really works worldwide, that things that might be perceived as, you know, cities from a satellite based on their sort of algorithms on the ground might not feel urban at all, or might have just an agricultural economy. So it's hard to define. We do not have like an agreed upon working definition of what is a city. Yes?
Do we know what the percentage is just within the United States?
It's 80 something based on our own definitions of urban, and I think that comes out pretty close to kind of like the uniform satellite based definition too. I don't remember exact number, but it's up there in the 80s at least. Yes?
As part of my project was I was with elementary kids, like from kindergarten to 8th grade, and we were around the pond. And at the time I thought it was really funny because every plant kids saw, they say, "Oh, don't touch that, it's poison ivy."
Oh.
and the sort of apex of it was pine cones on the ground. Don't touch that. Don't touch that, it's poison ivy. And it's just the you know, this extinction of experience. And it's like, I thought it was funny at the time, and now it's just like, oh my God, that's so sad.
Yeah. In the pink, yes, we.
Just on the second question, I just got back from a visit to New York City, so I was thinking a lot of the Greening of Manhattan article was interesting. It was written in 1990, right?
Yep,
So
not recent.
not recent, but you know, it was kind of the first time I visualized the suburbs and gathering up all the houses in the suburbs and turning them into a building and all the materials that, you know, the extra sewage lines that go through a suburb and all of that extra material that's in the suburbs kind of being centralized that way. So I resonated with that, but I think the frustrating part of it for me was that there's this element of, you know, he lived in a utopian sort of community in Manhattan, and it takes a certain amount of privilege and wealth to be able to choose that, right? And so the experience of people in a city is also colored by your wealth and your class, and so, you know, the choice to live in a city or the choice to value conservation in a city is sort of dependent on whether you have your essential needs met too, and you have housing and you have food. So I think there's that element there that maybe people aren't just choosing not to value conservation, but you know, and that's true in China too. We didn't see those cities pop up until close to, you know, the recent history. Most people were agrarian and they valued conservation because they depended on the land for their livelihood. So I think there's that tension there between, you know, people choose the choice element of this, valuing conservation.
Yeah, and the type of urban nature that you're kind of handed based on your sort of socioeconomic status, which we'll look a little bit more at that shortly. Let's do one more and then we should probably keep going.
I just, was like the definitions of city and like urban and stuff, we kind of are at a point where there aren't any really untouched things that aren't urbanized in some way. And like, I know, like even rural communities where it's all farmers, like that's not really like wild nature as it was, and it is really like you are impacting those environments. So these principles, and like the extinction experience of kids that live up in farms, they are just as afraid of things that they don't see necessarily, you know, on that farm, or they think, you know, the kids that are in rural communities still say, don't touch that, that's poison ivy. Like I hear that a lot with kids that they live in more rural areas, and I think like these principles kind of apply to those places too. Like it's not wild and it's not a city, but it's definitely highly touched by humans and a different ecosystem.
Yep, 100%. All right, We should probably keep going. Time is flying. But thank you for the thoughts. That was all great sort of perspectives to have on the table. And a lot of the same sort of phenomena that you mentioned, the sort of sense that there isn't nature in the city, the sense that we are, by building cities, just sort of disturbing nature and not part of it, is also kind of what kept science out of cities for a long time. I think I actually have graphs on that at some point, so I'm going to stop talking and wait for the slide to come up. But yeah, here it is. I've got a slide that's starting toward that idea. So one of the kind of quotes from the Cronin chapter that is sort of talking about this idea said that, recognizing nature in the city where our language itself has taught us to believe that nature no longer exists challenges our ability to see the world clearly. Pointing out that by language he's referring to sort of English and Western European, German languages that, and the way they were spoken sort of in the 1800s and early 1900s when cities were growing and when the discipline of ecology was also growing but avoiding cities. And here's the little timeline, just to keep sticking things on timelines. Now it starts at 1600 and goes up to 2000. Here we've got our Industrial Revolution, urbanization starts to kick up. And just to kind of put some of these ideas on the timeline with urbanization, in 1866 is when the German scientist Ernst Haeckel actually invented the discipline of ecology. Like there's a very discrete time point where he's like, zoologists, enough physiology, we need to think about how organisms relate to each other and their environment, not just how they function as a metabolism. That was in 1866, which was right around the same time. My words are cut off at the bottom. But the authors that Cronin was quoting, all of the sort of Victorian writers who were coming into the city and saying, this is this horrible, stinky, giant smoke cloud, forbidding environment, no nature here, was right around the same time that ecology was developing as a discipline. Then in the 1970s, we finally started to get the first urban ecology studies, right around the same time that people were realizing, as someone commented, there's nothing untouched. There's no point in trying to only do science in untouched nature because we've gotten DDT everywhere, we've gotten CO2 everywhere. Maybe we should actually go into cities and try to understand this stuff, like at some of it where it's coming from, at the source, where it's at its most concentrated. And then by the 1990s, which was when that chapter itself was published, was right when urban ecology was really going into its own exponential growth phase, and scientists were really starting to come into the city and try to understand, what is driving biodiversity here? How are people, shaping that? So that's kind of some of the timeline of what was going on. And then I wanted to look briefly, y'all brought up the Extinction of Experience paper. And for anybody who didn't get around to reading it, just kind of a quick recap, it posits this sort of vicious circle feedback loop between sort of urbanization, people living in cities, spending most of their time indoors, losing opportunities to interact with nature, which they don't fully define in the paper. I'm just going to call it sort of, interacting with nature would be doing sort of unstructured outdoor activities where your primary thing is interacting with other organisms, not humans, not the built environment. You lose opportunities to do that, and you kind of lose the goal to do that. As a result, you have this extinction of experience, which they provide some fairly sobering evidence. Wow, what was I supposed to be saying there? Gonna continue. Some fairly striking evidence that this extinction of experience actually is occurring. They gave several figures. I'll just show a couple of them to sort of make the point. But this data set from the UK was based on a survey where adults, which are the dark green bars, reported how often they visited natural areas as children, and then report how often their children visit natural areas, and then a very similar survey in the US. And the most frequent visits are on the left, and then the less often visits are on the right. So the main point is that, the adults when they were kids think that they were visiting nature much more often than their kids are, both in the UK and the US. There could be some rosy memories going on, it's always hard to know. But then this was a survey that did not rely on memory. It was done in the US 1997 and 2003 using the exact same survey methodology in the same region, random sample of humans, called them on the phone, and asked them, if their children participated in outdoor activities and how much time they spent outdoors in minutes per week. Just between 1997 and 2003, that amount of time dropped in the US. And then this last one is a similar survey in Japan, but again, this one's kind of starting to rely on memory again, asking people of different ages if they played in outdoor areas in their childhood. And certainly the older groups said they did so much more often than the youngest groups in their teens and 20s. So all evidence that they're using in this paper to kind of try and build evidence like this, the existence of this vicious circle was sort of proposed even in the 70s, and they were trying to kind of pull together all the evidence and see, like, does each step in this cycle actually happen? So that was their evidence that this step is happening. And then the next big one that definitely has negative consequences for our health and well-being. Later we'll talk about like one of those, can't talk about all of them. But the essential ones to like form the feedback loop are the emotional and attitudinal changes toward the outdoors, which then result in behavioral changes where you're less likely to seek outdoor activity and less likely to make choices that would support preservation of outdoor areas. And so again, these were just little data sets that they summarized from other studies into this paper, showing that in the UK, people who grew up in urban and suburban areas had a lower sort of affective connection score, like a lower emotional response to nature than folks who grew up in rural areas. And then this study in the US took it a step farther and showed that people who did have nature experiences in childhood had stronger attitudes toward environmental issues and were more likely to do things like recycle and make voting decisions based on environmental issues. So the take home from this paper was like their conclusion is we need to get kids out in nature, even sort of relatively small doses. We don't know yet how small of a dose would work. We probably need to get past the don't touch it, it's poison ivy stage for it to have sort of that lasting emotional bonding effect. But how do we do that? And one of the examples that they gave was this program in the UK where Natural England, which is their government agency that sort of keeps track of green spaces, developed recommendations that every person in England should be less than a 5-minute walk from a natural area of 1.2 acres or a green space, some kind of park, or about 5 minutes from a bigger 5-acre park. So one of those two things, and they should be able to get to a 25-acre park within a 15-minute walk. And then they made these maps of like where are those criteria actually met. This is just a sort of arbitrary chunk of sort of Western London suburbs. And the places that meet those criteria are the ones where the dark blue and light blue overlap. And on a national scale, they concluded that only about a third of the population actually has that ideal level of green space access that they fairly arbitrarily identified as like what they would want. This is still a fairly new program. It's up to every individual city to implement it. So the national scale program is like keeping an eye on it, helping them map things, but not actually implementing stuff. But they're supposedly doing kind of a monitoring and evaluation program, but it's still relatively new, so I didn't find any kind of progress report. But just one example of a country that has noticed this problem and is trying to do something about it. Yes?
So when you say nature, when I think of nature, I'm thinking of the natural world. When you talk about a park, there could be an acre of grass that to me is not natural. Is it the same as far as what you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know if they would count like just a soccer field in this or not. I would hope not. The goal is to have, it would still be a park. There would probably be some manicured stuff. It would not be a fully untouched forest somewhere within the city, but someplace that somebody could go like take a walk and feel like they're out of the city or getting a break from the city.
And there are two other influences that I think are less spoken about, or not at all, never mind that, which is people can now, because of the insidious invasion of the internet and iPhones and laptops and pads and everything, which really nobody, you don't go at, and I don't go anywhere without my phone because I feel like it's an emergency device, you know?
Mhm.
But people can be in nature and prefer
Not really in it.
the company of the phone. You know, we've all seen people walking along the street like this, because that's a kind of an addiction that's blocking our perceptions of nature, really.
Mhm.
And the other is, the way that, well, I know in New York City, we could certainly look at it and see the structure of the city was changed along what I think are generally accepted to be very racist lines. In The Power Broker, I think by Robert Caro, he talks about how what's his name? Robert Moses, you know, divided up and sort of decimated areas that were very established and positive, you know, communities of people of color, and he would use those as, well, let's just go through this, you know, and that
like
destroyed.
put a freeway through it or
Yeah,
whatever.
that just destroyed the access, I know, certainly in the Northeast. So our sense of nature can be deranged even if we're not that physically far from it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that, like, yeah, being in nature, looking at your phone probably doesn't actually have the benefits to you or nature of you actually being there. And I don't know how any of these, I mean, most of the studies that I was showing you are kind of older, like actually before the cell phone days, and I don't know if anybody's followed up since we all got glued to our phones to see how that would affect like, our emotional response to being there. And so the last bit from the extinction of experience, I think it sounds like it's stuff that you all are like already kind of involved in, but kind of the other stuff that they acknowledge in the paper is that, yeah, it's true that just putting some nature there nearby doesn't guarantee that people are going to go to it. They might, you know, stay indoors and play a video game. So they talked about kind of the need for programming to force the kids to get out and have those experiences and hopefully bond with them, which it sounds like is already happening. But maybe we have some kind of additional reasons for it now. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave this segment of our cities natural. Could we make them more natural and restore that kind of lost bond between people and nature? And then I want to stop talking about feelings and start talking about just kind of the urban physical environment. How do we actually characterize it? What happens in a city that affects, you know, the organisms that live in it? And on a gut level, it's easy to see, like, everything's super different. Does anybody recognize where this is?
Manhattan.
Yep, well done. That is Manhattan. It's an artist's rendition of it before settlement. Here it was in 2009. The island got fatter because it got all of the landfill when it was leveled to build buildings on it. It got sort of wider. The hundreds of streams and springs that were on it got sort of sent underground or filled. Yes.
I'm terrible with history. Why did they choose that place to build this giant? Because it's the greatest harbor in the Northeast.
We'll go with that. I don't have a definitive answer, but yeah, like that's where Hudson came up the river and saw land, and it seemed like a convenient place, and it's sort of surrounded by water, so it's accessible and defensible.
And we were selling all of our pine trees. The English needed them for masts, and that was a perfect location to go up and down the whole northeast coast. I mean, you could get on the water and go down to Virginia, down to, you know, Florida if you wanted. And I just think that it was so well situated. And beavers, we still, you know, when they still had animals. And I guess that's the Meadowlands to the left. I guess that's New Jersey if you go through the Meadowlands.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's Long Island City.
So the transformation is huge. It clearly was not uninhabited before, but kind of everything changed. And we'll look at some of the, I was gonna have you guys do another activity, but we'll just keep going. So we'll think about kind of the main features of cities in terms of kind of, we said there wasn't gonna be like a clear definitive definition of a city, but there are some things that have to happen for a city to exist. There has to be infrastructure. You gotta have buildings, roads, and then there has to be an economy. You've gotta have either manufacturing, commerce, transportation, and you've gotta have residents. So if you took away any of those things, you probably wouldn't have something that you recognized as a city. So that's the stuff you kind of do on purpose. And then there are these sort of byproducts that, like, the stuff that you do into the environment in order to get your infrastructure and your residences and your commerce, which is you take away the vegetation that was there, which reduces the amount of open space because you build stuff on it. You modify the aquatic habitats, that's all of the sort of like putting the streams underground, changing the flow of water. Replace pervious surfaces with impervious ones. Impervious just meaning impermeable to water, so things like pavements, rooftops. You produce, oh, I've got a little thing about that. And then in the act of manufacturing and transporting, you end up producing pollution and waste. And these things all have environmental consequences that are not necessarily intended, not necessarily required to have a city, but certainly we have not figured out how to have a city without them. So you end up with habitat loss, fragmentation, and isolation. Number 2, you end up with altered hydrology. You end up with big climatic changes in the city compared to the outlying areas. You end up with noise and light pollution. And you end up with chemical pollution of the air, water, and soil.
And you end up with less animals than humans.
Yep.
You were talking before about the definition of the city. To me, the definition of the city is any place that has less mammals, birds, and reptiles than humans.
Don't the rats outnumber the
I was
people
just
in New
gonna
York?
say, have you been to New York? Yeah.
And the ants certainly do. So it depends on the animal. Point taken, but good move, because there's always, well, I don't know about always, not doing great, but at present, there's still always going to be more of them. And all of these things happen in this kind of web of interconnected cause and effect, which from the point of view of like doing science in cities, it's hard then to tell like if an organism is responding to a climatic change that resulted from, you know, paving everything, or if it's resulting from, you know, if it's responding to the pavement itself. It's all kind of confounded and hard to study. But these things all sort of co-occur in cities everywhere. The habitat loss, fragmentation, and isolation, you know, kind of looks like this. We clear off the vegetation, we build stuff, and the green areas that are left, there's, you know, a nice big central park there for Manhattan, but everything else is just these tiny little fragments of forest and green stuff. Only 9% of the land area is still something green that might even remotely resemble, you know, habitat that existed there before.
Except for Inwood Park right up at the top, which is an old growth forest that is mostly untouched since about 1600.
Did you say Inwood?
Inwood
Yeah,
Park.
Inwood Hill, isn't that's the one up on the very end up there?
Yeah, it's like 120-foot tall, like,
Yeah.
tulip trees and stuff.
But still, like, cut off from everything else. Depending on what species you're talking about. And I guess that's kind of my next point, is that like what is isolated, like we saw habitat loss and fragmentation, but then what's isolated? And that depends on what species you're talking about. Just as a quick example, like white-footed mice have been well studied in New York, sticking with that example, and based on sort of a combination of geospatial analyses and genetic analyses. Researchers have determined that every single park that they sampled throughout New York City was a genetically distinct population of white-footed mice, so they were, you know, isolated, not like, moving back and forth frequently, but that their level of isolation was best explained by the amount of canopy cover between the parks, not the actual absolute distance between the parks. So if you get under 70% canopy cover, mice are perceiving that as something that they will not cross. And then you get even, you know, more distantly related populations. So that's for mice. For rats, the population genetic structure looks totally different. Here, the same lab that studied the mice population genetics also did rats throughout Manhattan. On this map, every square represents where they sampled, and then they assigned, like they found the kind of the best fit analysis showed that really all of their rats fit into two populations, one with all of the black spots, one with the white spots. So there was some kind of barrier here through Midtown, which they think was probably because that's a less residential area, less food available, more big transportation hubs that are actively poisoning rats, so they're less likely to cross through here, but everything above that, sort of evenly mixed. Rats were most likely to mate with near neighbors, so there was like population genetic structure, but it changed evenly across the whole island, from there to the top and then from here down. So rats are clearly not perceiving canopy cover as a barrier. They can move sort of freely. The thing that's a barrier for the mice is actually like the conduit for the rats. So point being, isolation. What counts as an isolated habitat is species specific. So that's sort of quick comments on what counts as habitat loss, fragmentation, and isolation. We'll take a quick look at altered hydrology, just sort of to acknowledge its existence. I think this is probably common knowledge for this group. But we get huge changes in what happens to water, especially during a storm in a city. So looking at sort of a baseline situation in a forest, in a temperate zone, when it rains, the vegetation itself catches the first few millimeters, never even hits the ground. What does hit the ground, about half of it infiltrates either shallowly or into the groundwater, and only about 10% actually like runs off the surface and goes downhill. As you add impervious surface to that landscape, we'll just look at the other extreme example, which is the estimate for sort of a typical 75 to 100% impervious landscape. Now there's not vegetation to catch the rain. The impervious surfaces themselves can maybe only catch a millimeter or two, unlike the 6 that a tree canopy could catch. So much more makes it to the ground. When it does hit the ground, it's going to hit pavement and not soak in. So only about 15% gets infiltrated, and the other 55% runs off along these hot, paved, dirty surfaces and goes tearing into streams in its warm, dirty state, and causes this sort of flashy hydrology of urban streams where they no longer have a nice little floodplain. They increase their flow rate and their depth very quickly, cause erosion, and then once the storm is over and all of the runoff is dashed off the pavement, they sink back down to a low sort of base level. And this matters for, obviously creatures that live in the streams. It prevents that from being habitat for various kinds of fish and insects that need, the complex habitat structure that gets washed out when that happens. And then that, also reduces the sort of nature and recreation opportunities for people who might be using that riparian area as their nature experience.
Also as their drinking water, and it can contribute to completely killing all of the bivalves of freshwater mussels. We just destroy everything.
Back, were the mice, back to the mice, were they a native?
Yes, they are native.
And then the rats?
The rats are not native. But it's not necessarily universal. Like, I think here, you're getting at a good point there. Are the non-natives that are showing up in cities, are they doing better there? And there are definitely some, urban exploiters or sort of urban winners that are native species, like peregrine falcons are some of the ones that have done great in cities, I guess preying on a non-native rock dove, but there are some native ants that do great in cities. So it's not like black and white, the natives perish, the non-natives thrive, but there is some of that. Next big change, climatic changes in cities, of which the urban heat island is sort of the big prominent example, the one that I study the most often. And it's just this phenomenon in which cities are usually, they're warmer than their surroundings. In the eastern US, typically air temperatures are about 1 to 3 degrees Celsius hotter, more at night, less during the day. And then surfaces, which is what you're seeing in this is a Landsat thermal image of eastern North Carolina. I don't know if you can tell where we are in this picture. You can certainly tell where the cities are because they're the bright red spots, where this redder is hotter, blue is cooler. This is actually the eastern end of Raleigh, and then the little cities heading east. And so this difference in climate is significant to life in cities, humans and otherwise. Like, we certainly see elevated death rates during heat waves in cities compared to outside of the cities. And this is all due to, I mean, if we followed our little web of cause and effect, the biggest contributors are really, I'll start with the second one, the loss of vegetation, which you lose the shade that provides, and you lose the evapotranspiration, which very conveniently converts moisture to a gas without actually raising its temperature. You lose that out. You can only heat things if there's no moisture. And then urban surfaces or urban construction materials have thermal properties that allow them to store a lot of heat and to store it quickly. So when the sun does hit them, they heat up, they store that heat. And then also, there's just a much greater mass of material in cities. Like, if you weigh a forest versus an equal area city, the city is gonna weigh far more. So it's able to store more heat and then release that heat at night to warm the air and prevent it from cooling off. So you end up with patterns like this of air temperature where this is one diurnal cycle from, I don't know why I started it at like midday and then sunset and then sunrise over here at the end. But the rural air temperature would be in blue, so it warms up during the day and then cools off very quickly at night, whereas the city, it doesn't necessarily warm up that much during the day, that much more than the rural area. But at night, when the surfaces are no longer absorbing heat, then that's the source of sort of the stored solar energy for that system, and it prevents the air from cooling off overnight. So that's your urban heat island effect in the air. The surface temperatures themselves do kind of the opposite. They heat right up during the day in the city, and then they cool off at night as they're transferring their energy to the air. So I think kind of the interesting thing about that, at least for me, is that different organisms sort of living at different elevations in a city are either going to be more entrained to the surface. Like, if you're an ant walking around, you're probably experiencing the surface urban heat island. If you're us and your head is a couple meters above the surface of the earth, or if you're a bird, you're really more experiencing the air temperature heat island, which is more intense at night. Also, noise and light pollution are big sort of phenomena in cities, just to quickly acknowledge those. This was a noise pollution map of the US that the Department of Transportation made in, I don't remember when they made it, but it was based on 2018 data. And at that point, they concluded that 23% of the US population was exposed to transport noise that was louder than a refrigerator hum, just kind of constantly. Which doesn't actually sound that bad. Their report from like 4 years before that had estimated like 80% of the population or something, and they backed it down. But then it's certainly in some areas, like back to New York, 2.3% of the US population is exposed to transport noise at least as loud as a vacuum cleaner on a regular basis. And so, of course, this is stressful to us. We could put in earplugs if we really needed to avoid it, but then things like birds who are communicating with sound, frogs, crickets, either can't handle it and can't live there, or they actually, change their voices or change their sort of cycle of activity to try and compensate and to still be able to get their message across. So there are lots of examples of birds singing louder or singing higher pitched in cities. And usually that's just a behavioral response. If you take those birds back out of the city, they tone it back down. There's not signs that that's an evolutionary change yet. Light pollution is another biggie. This is just a map of light at night from satellite imagery from 2016. Some researchers even use this as their signature of where cities are on the planet as a clearer indicator than impervious surfaces. And this has been a relatively understudied aspect of the urban environment until fairly recently. We're seeing a lot more work on it now, but we know for our own health and for everything from birds to plants to moths that it interferes with sort of your diurnal cycle, your physiology, your ability to sleep. For moths, their ability to find things. That is a case of urban evolution where urban moths of some species are evolving to be less attracted to light. They're better able to function and not like just run off toward the light the way they used to. So light pollution is another defining feature of cities that's still under sort of active research. And then to just give totally short shrift to pollution, because one could spend days on it and name many different pollutant compounds. In general, fossil fuel combustion is the big source of urban pollution. Also inputs of food, fertilizer, pet waste tend to increase the nutrient loads in cities, in the soils and in the waterways. And then anything that sort of winds up on the roads, salt, oil, dust from your car brakes and tires, all of that winds up on the ground, and next time it rains, it washes into, the rest of the habitat. And individual cities also, like this is kind of the universal stuff. Salt, not so much, that's more in the temperate zone, but every city tends to have its own kind of pollutant signature too, depending on its own like industrial and transportation history. So that concludes our sort of quickie inventory of the urban, sort of the environmental consequences of urbanization, the things that we think organisms and cities would respond to. The last thing I want to kind of acknowledge, totally cut off on the bottom, is there anything we can do about, wait, which one? If we can zoom out a tiny bit. I don't know if folks can really even see the very bottom of the screen.
I think we can fix it for after the break.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So anyway, the bottom says, spatial and temporal structure arise from human technology and society. Point being, like, this stuff is fairly universal. All cities experience them to some extent, but the spatial distribution of these changes is not, oh, there it is, is not random or uniform in space. Some neighborhoods have much stronger heat islands, much, flashier streams than others. And one paper that I should have given you to read, I don't know why I didn't put it in your folder. If you all are interested, I can send it afterward, or maybe you have it.
That would be good to have.
Is this paper, it was published in 2020, called The Ecological and Evolutionary Consequences of Systemic Racism in Urban Environments. And it covered a lot of territory, and it's clearly having a big influence on, how ecologists and environmental scientists are studying cities. It's 4 years old now, and it's already been cited in more than 300 other peer-reviewed papers, more than 500 times according to Google Scholar. And we're also finally getting to the point where some of the sort of ideas and questions that were brought up 4 years ago are starting to be tested with data and revealing some really striking effects of sort of historical racist processes on present-day environmental conditions. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on those ideas too. Kind of the overall thesis of this paper was, first that human social processes structure the urban environment. That's not really new. Like, we've known that, people make cities, and our, the ways that we organize our zoning and who has a say in that, that's part of being a city. And then also that this results in uneven distribution of environmental issues like heat, pollution, and habitat loss. And it went on to predict that, and so this also still isn't really new. Like, this, we knew that cities have environmental justice problems, and then this paper took it one step further and said that this structural racism that contributed to the sort of layout of cities in the past, and honestly still in some ongoing ways, even though no longer formally legal according to the federal government, affects the habitat, which then also is going to affect the movement of animals and plants through those areas, which is going to affect the ecology and evolution of those organisms. And that's the part that hadn't really been fully spelled out before this paper, is that our sort of social legacies are going to affect the very evolution of the organisms living alongside us in the cities. So how might that happen? One of the major examples of the ways that sort of social stratification and social inequality is structuring urban environments is redlining. Have you all, who's familiar with that idea? So pretty much everybody, so almost everybody. I'm not going to say too much about it, but there's been a growing awareness of it in the scientific community too, partly because of this mapping inequality project at the University of Richmond that has dug up these old neighborhood maps from sort of the 1930s to the 1960s, digitized them, put them online so everybody can get them. This is one of Durham. So just to get you oriented, like University Drive is down here, Main Street's here. This is Trinity Park. I used to live like right there. What these colors are referring to, I'll get to in a second, but so redlining in general is just a shorthand word for a variety of racially discriminatory housing policies that were overtly practiced in the US from the 1930s to the 60s. And the term comes from the red zones on that map, on the maps like the one I just showed you. And the maps were initially drawn by the federal government, by their homeowners loan corporation, or the HOLC, that rated neighborhoods into 4 categories, where red was the one that would be a risky investment for a bank or an investor to offer a housing loan. And the HOLC itself was formed to sort of support home ownership in the wake of the Great Depression. And kind of ironically, it actually did give slightly more loans in those red zones than in other areas. But the whole rest of the world also got hold of these maps, and other branches of the federal government, and bankers, and investors, and identified these red areas, which were typically like racially diverse, non-white neighborhoods, as places that they would be, that it would be risky to give home loans, so they wouldn't do it, or you could only get like a very predatory loan with impossible rates. Whereas the green zones, rated A, were ones that often had sort of racial covenants that you had to be white to even move in there. Often developers had to promise to get their own loans to develop a neighborhood, that they would have such a covenant in place. So these kinds of policies and practices cemented some pre-existing environmental inequalities and also created new ones, took previously sort of pleasant neighborhoods and prevented new home ownership in them. And so we still see legacies of these environmental effects of this, like, today. This sort of practice was formally banned in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but that did nothing to reverse any of the sort of changes that were wrought by these policies. Yes?
Even though they're not technically legal, like racial covenants are still on the books in a lot of places, right?
I don't, are they? I don't know, honestly. Like, I'm sure that this kind of stuff is still going on. I don't know if it's like out in the open on the books. It's certainly not technically legal, so I would imagine that it's not on the books, but probably practiced
There's so many
informally.
things that are technically not legal that have been going on, like, just, I mean, anybody who's lived the last, 8 years has seen it. There's so many illegal things going on, and I think that that's, it's like, have at it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So yeah, these historical and to the extent that it's ongoing, ongoing practices are definitely.
And also private corporations, they're their own law. And now more and more, what is it, like 50%, 60% of all homes are owned of the housing stock is in the hands of private equity. So yeah, our corporate overlords have decimated.
Yeah.
But okay.
Yeah, housing equity has definitely not been accomplished.
And in so many ways.
Yeah, we're nowhere close. And the environmental effects of these decades of sort of discriminatory housing policies are also still completely visible in the landscape. Like, this is a map, Baltimore's redlining map from the 1930s, and then the present day canopy cover in the same areas, where like the darker green is more trees, and hence, less urban heat island, less flashy stormwater, less flooding, and then the lighter areas have less canopy, so dealing with, more noise pollution, more heat, all of the things.
Oh, those are the red districts there.
Yes, exactly. The light canopy covers correspond to the red districts. The green canopy covers correspond to the blue A-rated zones. And this is common across cities in the US. This is just a figure from an analysis where people pulled together data from 38 different cities that had redlining maps available, and they compared the A-rated sort of desirable neighborhoods, B, C, and then the redlined risky neighborhoods And pretty consistently across cities, they saw the pattern where like, the canopy cover is in the A-rated neighborhoods, and the missing canopy cover is in the redlined neighborhoods.
So was redlining a cause or an effect sort of a phenomenon we call white flight? I mean, what happened first? Was it first that more affluent white families started fleeing certain neighborhoods, and then they were called more risky by the banks effectively, therefore only leaving certain populations there, kind of leaving it in a downward spiral?
I think there
Because
might
that
have
map
been
of
some.
Baltimore basically showed it, like, the good neighborhoods are out here.
Yeah.
The crap neighborhoods are here by the water.
Yeah, I'm not sure kind of like how the chicken and egg cycle started there. I think there was some of both. Because there were definitely, you know, neighborhoods that were ruined by this. It's not just cementing already poor quality environments into red line districts. Some went from like good to having no home ownership as a result of this policy. But I think probably like some of what you're saying also occurred as new developments were made and applied their racial covenants. Then, like, yeah, yes.
Yeah, I just add that the, urban renewal had a big part in that too. That there were, you know, the Baltimore City Planning Department had maps of putting the highways right through poor and black neighborhoods basically in Baltimore. So that had a lot to do with, you know, the transportation had a lot to do with in Baltimore. But
Yeah, and that's pretty common across cities.
And here.
Yeah.
Right, so like 147 was dropped on K-Tide.
Right.
Yep.
And there are studies, I mean, all of this has also been done like at the scale of Durham as well. There was a master's project that came out of some Duke environmental students, and there's current work going on actually at NC State where you're looking at this. And it's the exact same thing is you can't overlay our redlining maps and our tree cover maps to this day. Like it's
I
on
think
here.
like Durham is making some effort, right?
They
But
realized
it's
it, and they're
complicated.
doing a tremendous amount of work to try and address it. But it also goes into this thing that, like you were talking about earlier, where you have extinction of experience, right? Where now you have communities that are not used to having tree cover, and they might see trees as one more thing to care for, one more thing that could damage the house I worked so hard to get, all these other things. So then you have to, and you can't just go into a neighborhood and say, here, this would be better.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That you're not doing the right thing there either. So then you have to kind of rebuild even the trust in the relationship.
In some of the poor areas of Durham, in some of the, Durham, especially in some of the more low-income areas, the invasive plants have just taken over, and there's huge poison ivy all along the borders of the sidewalks. And
Don't
so
touch it.
nobody wants to live there.
Yeah.
And
It's
it's
so disinvested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poison ivy is a native of the birds love the berries. Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Say more toxins and everywhere, and those are huge, and so it's a problem.
Yeah. Yes.
Having worked with, doing like tree planting projects for municipal bodies, one thing that we have found is that depending on lot size has a lot to do with it. If you have a small lot and you live in one of these underserved communities, planting a tree there is seen as taking up a huge amount of your yard, of your available space, whereas if you're in a more affluent area and you have a larger lot, planting a tree doesn't really take that much percentage of your property away. And so that was one of the hindrances we had, is that I can't give 20 feet of my yard away because I only have 25 feet of yard. And so that was a big barrier and that we had to overcome, and then we started looking at woody shrubs as an alternative to tree offerings for those situations.
And how did that go? Like, was that a
That's much more acceptable,
interesting?
because they would rather have some shrubs in the front than a tree taking up
Yeah.
and shading their whole house. They have no sunlight.
Yeah. I think you were
I
next.
just had a question with, just in regards to like back to the urban heat island and like the tree cover and things like that, and my own experience like growing things in the city, like you're forming kind of microclimates that are different, but also like larger weather patterns. So does that, I mean, I know from my experience like that affects what can grow and like how you do like restorative kind of green spaces and And then you have these areas that are like no trees and like even trying to establish any kind of like growth there or growth things in pods is like extremely difficult. So is there like research on like that kind of area or like, I don't know.
I think that especially on green rooftops, which are like super challenging growing environments in cities, there's a lot of research on just like what plants can we put here. I don't see as much, maybe you would see it more than I would if it's out there, on plant selection for actual urban environments. Like sometimes I think like your growing zone like will dip up in the city a little bit, and it does make, you know, a different climate, a longer growing season. So it's certainly observed that plants behave differently in the city, or things that can't live outside of the city do live inside the city, and vice versa. But also people tend to like water things and coddle things that wouldn't live there also. So like in some cities you actually see higher plant diversity in the city than outside because of that combination of sort of climate and human care, and it's hard to know exactly what makes the difference. But
I think the main place where we see the conversation is actually around trees, and it's because of not only might we be a zone higher than even the northern part of the county here, but then you're also looking at something where you're trying to project out 100 to 150 years, right? Because it's a tree, so it's got to like last for a while, and so then we start seeing recommendations shifting toward maybe like more southern elements of the Piedmont, so a similar soil profile, but kind of moving down the Piedmont to get to like a warmer area or a droughtier area or something like that. Yeah.
Have they studied Detroit? Because Detroit is fascinating. It was very urban. Then, you know, Roger and Me happened. And now, well, there are people sort of reclaiming it. My dream had been, I'm just going to go buy a feral house and live there. But have you seen the feral houses? There's so many abandoned houses that trees have started growing up through the living room and coming out the roof. And they're just spectacular. And it's like nature just reclaimed it once it was abandoned.
Yeah, definitely there has been, like there's a lot of urban ecology work going on in Detroit. I haven't seen that specifically come up, but a lot of the abandoned lots in that and other sort of, you know, industrial cities that emptied out of people, like a lot of the abandoned lots got converted into like little pocket parks or little native plant prairies or community gardens. So I've seen a lot of kind of community garden research in that part of the country. But yeah.
If you just type in Detroit and then feral houses, it's just amazing.
Huh.
You're just going to want to go there.
With a tree growing in the house.
Oh, it's just amazing. But anyway.
So we looked at canopy cover and redlining, and I'm not going to dwell on these studies, but these are examples of some of the more recent work that's coming out that then follows up on ideas about ecology and evolution, like moving beyond canopy cover and like how is wildlife responding to the environments that were sort of created and cemented in place this way. And we've already seen examples based on sort of a reanalysis of pre-existing data that they pulled together from different studies that, I mean, in this study they used not redlining per se, but just I think 2010 census data to identify primarily black neighborhoods versus primarily white neighborhoods, and compared the genetic diversity of wildlife living in those environments, and found that the primarily black neighborhoods did have wildlife with lower genetic diversity, supporting the kind of idea from that original paper that the kinds of environmental burdens that are imposed in those neighborhoods are also hindering animal movement, isolating wildlife populations in those areas. But also we see that there is a lot of missing information. Across the board, on average, there's certainly exceptions, but redline neighborhoods tend to have lower reporting of citizen science data, like on eBird or iNaturalist. And also, like, academic researchers tend to spend less time in those neighborhoods until recently, when it's become like sort of, you know, we've been spurred to go in there and start doing research there where it was previously avoided. Yeah.
There's a great local Durham example of that. There's a researcher, a PhD student at NC State named Jin Bai, BAI, whose research was featured in the New York Times, I think, earlier this summer.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I did not see it in the New York Times, but he was in class when you were. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Did he publish? I was just looking yesterday. Like, did he and Madhu publish that yet? Like, I want to talk about their bird study.
It's been published, and so that it was like a sneak preview in the summer. but it was looking at like Long End Park and things like that.
Yeah.
Specifically just a local example of this research.
Yeah, and last I heard from Jen, they were finding, like they did find kind of the expected canopy cover differences between neighborhoods that were redlined versus, A-rated neighborhoods. But as far as bird diversity in the parks, it was pretty, they were equitably distributed, probably because, the environments in the parks have been, maintained or maybe retrofitted to a better state than they were, at the time of redlining. And so if that's still the story, that's encouraging. All right, so we've now gotten through part 3. I'm gonna have to step it up, but I think we should take a break. We've been at this for an hour and a half, so let's take a break and reconvene in like 10 minutes.
Can I ask if anybody is interested?
All right, welcome back. We've got just over an hour left. We're probably not gonna get through everything on my list, but let's see what we get to. So the next sort of topic on the list is, we've talked about the urban physical environment, what are the big changes, kind of what structures, how they're arranged in the environment, and then what does that actually do to organisms? And on the whole, kind of obviously, but we'll state the obvious, like cities do reduce biodiversity. There are exceptions, like I said, where some cities, the plant diversity is higher in the city than outside the city because it has this mixture of native and non-native plants and cultivated things and feral things. But on average, most organisms, you have fewer species in the city than out of the city in the same region. And cities also kind of only admit species with certain traits. They sort of filter out ones who aren't able to disperse through the urban environment or who can't find suitable conditions. And then cities also drive adaptive and non-adaptive evolution in populations of animals that live in them. So we'll look at some examples of all of these things. In terms of biodiversity loss, current global estimates are that about 20% of bird species show up in cities and live there. About 5% of plants, so even though some cities have more than their surroundings, most plants are not coming in. And about 3.4% of mammals occur regularly in urban areas. It's maybe not quite as bad as it sounds because cities are only taking up about 3% of the land area, but still we are losing diversity in those areas. And also, cities tend to be built in non-random places on the globe in biodiversity hotspots. So here I don't know how well this shows up, but the black areas are kind of the human, representing human population density.
Oh.
And the colors, the red, the colors are representing bird biodiversity, the native birds. So the reddest areas have the highest bird diversity, the blue areas have the lowest. And if you ignore the Amazon, in general, you're seeing the highest clumps of, the black human population density, the black dots representing population density of all humans, tend to overlay with kind of the red and yellow areas. Like you see on a global sort of coarse scale that people are putting their cities in places that there's also a lot of biodiversity. There are various ideas for why this might be. In general, it's thought that just kind of the conditions that are nice for all of life are also places that attract people. It tends to be sort of heterogeneous habitats along coastal areas or along rivers, sort of rich places that are also good for farming, have also been sort of cradles of biodiversity for other species. And this was kind of a weirdly late realization. People didn't map this out and notice until like the 1990s that we were putting our cities in places that have high endemic biodiversity and could quickly become biodiversity hotspots. So, whoa, I just skipped a bunch of stuff. So that even makes it matter more what is happening to our biodiversity in our cities because they're landing in these particularly biodiverse areas that have a lot of endemic species that may, be getting, have their last little populations getting circumscribed by cities and winding up in fragments. So what does happen to organisms when a city happens? The actual process of building structures is a pretty scorched earth thing. And we see, it's actually rare to be able to follow it through in real time, but we see in the few examples that have followed the construction process through time, we see species getting just completely wiped out during that process and then having to disperse back in. This is pictures from one example in Indiana where people were able to go sample ants before a suburb was developed. And then so they set out baits and saw how many species showed up. In the pre-development state, they got 20 species. Then during the actual construction process, only 3 showed up. It should have been, based on the season, should have been everybody, but only 3 of the 20 showed up. And then a full year later, after, some of the vegetation was, at least there was grass, still only 4 species. The 3 that were there during construction plus 1 more had made it back in a year later. And then because this development had happened over time, they also went and sampled a 10-year-old part of it, and there only found 7 of the sort of 20 expected species. So the point is, over time, we build these structures, it sort of wipes out species from that spot, and they've got to disperse back in. In this example, it should have been pretty easy. There was still forest just a few blocks away, but nobody was coming back. And so creatures have to disperse back in. We already acknowledged that sort of different landscape features represent barriers to different organisms, and not all of them are able or willing to cross back into an urban area after it's been developed and after they've been initially eliminated. And this is known in ecology as the process of dispersal limitation, where the distribution of a species in space is shaped by its ability to actually arrive there. Due to sort of their propagules, the dispersal phase, their seeds, their young adults, not being able to actually, reach all parts of the environment equally. Once organisms do make it in, which is, not all of them are going to, things like, little newts that have to walk across the road and only have a 20% chance of making it, or flightless fireflies that would have to walk back in over a very perilous landscape, might just not make it back to an area after it's been urbanized. Even very mobile organisms like European blackbirds have taken hundreds of years to move back into cities. They're there now, and now they're one of the most common birds in cities across Europe, but they stayed out for hundreds of years after cities were initially built. Once they get there, then they have to actually deal with the abiotic environment, all those changes that we talked about. And here, the process that ecologists talk about is environmental filtering, the process in which the abiotic environment, so the temperature, the water availability, the presence of pollutants, so that abiotic environment functions as kind of a sieve or a filter that lets some species in if they've got particular traits that make them able to cope with those conditions, and eliminates ones that aren't able to cope. Rarely is an environmental filter as sort of black and white as that. Usually, there will be some gradient where a species is present but not doing well, has a lower reproductive rate. So it's not a black and white, it's here or it's not here, but you see lower population sizes or lower reproductive rates or lower genetic diversity in cities when an environmental filter is operating. And just to give kind of an example from a project that I worked on several years ago, where we wanted to know if urban warming was acting as kind of an environmental filter on bee communities in Raleigh, and this was something that, the lab that I was a postdoc in at the time had April Hamlin was doing her master's there, and she went out and sampled bees at 18 different sites around Raleigh that were in hotter or cooler parts of the urban heat island. And after 2 full summers of sampling, catching thousands of bees, something I might not want to do anymore, but she found that for every degree Celsius of urban warming, overall bee abundance declined by 40% per degree Celsius. But that decline was not even across species, so I don't expect you to actually read these, but sort of each row on this graph is a different individual species of bee. And ones that kind of have their little error bars crossing the 0 line are ones that have stable populations. Ones over here are ones that are declining relative to warming.
But are they all native bees or a mix of native and non-native?
Everybody on this list is native. There were honeybees in the study, but we didn't use them in this part of the study because we couldn't keep them alive in the lab long enough to do the next step that I'm about to show you that you're also probably going to cringe about. But we wanted to know,
But for every degree, that must mean there's practically no bees left because.
Well, 40% per degree makes kind of it's there's sort of a half-life. It's not you don't lose, how do I want to say it? It's an exponential decline, so it does level off. And there's not that many degrees Celsius of urban warming. It's like maybe 3-ish. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds, but it was pretty striking. And most of the individual species were declining, but some more than others. And so we wanted to know, like, if this relates to urban warming, then there should be some physiological trait in the bees, like their level of heat tolerance, that would predict, like, oh, are the the bees that if you heat them up in the lab, they die sooner? Are those these bees? And are these bees the ones that can take it really hot? So we did that awful little assay where you bring the bees back in the lab and you heat them up until the point where they lose muscular control, basically go into sort of bee heat stroke, which is awful. Although if we could know that one trait and then predict how bees are going to do in cities, that's better than catching 3,000 of them to find their actual population trend. And it was predictive. It was a bit of a messy relationship, but here, this is that, like, the response to warming, the level of population decline. So if you're below 0, like, you're declining. These are the most stable populations across the urban gradient over here. And then on this axis, we've got their heat tolerance, like how hot could they get in the lab before they gave up. And there is, like, a positive relationship here where the bees with the highest heat tolerance also had the most stable populations across the urban warming gradient. So the point of this story for today, like, that's kind of what we're looking for when we're thinking about environmental filtering, evidence of some trait-environment interaction that tells us kind of which part of the urban environment might be interacting with which aspects of the organism's physiology or, behavior to keep it out of the city or cause it to decline in the city. That's one example with 15 bee species. Lately, people have been scaling it up. Urban ecology has been going on long enough that there are large data sets available. Just last year, this research team compiled data from like 70,000 study sites that were used to study 5,302 species in 379 cities in 48 countries, and those species included amphibians, bats, bees, birds, carabids, and reptiles, like multiple species in each category. And so they kind of did something similar to what we did with bees, only they did it for a bunch of different traits: body size, feeding traits, mobility, reproductive rates, relative to just urbanization level, not heat or a specific aspect of urbanization, but the amount of urban land cover within 500 meters of wherever those organisms were sampled. And there's a lot going on in this figure. They went into it asking, like, is there a universal set of urban traits? Like, no matter what you are, is it good to, like, be small and lay lots of eggs or have lots of babies, for example? And they didn't really find that. Looking at frogs specifically, it kind of looks like there's patterns here, but none of them actually explained much variation in the data. So amphibians, like, no clear urban trait, no clear set of traits was favored in cities compared to non-cities. For bats, they found patterns everywhere. The little stars on here mean that that urbanization explained, like, more of the variation in the trait in these models. So for bats, it was good to have a larger body size, to be an aerial hunter over other kinds of hunters, like, gleaning or perching. Having a high aspect ratio on your wings was their mobility trait, so sort of like fast but less maneuverable, tended to increase in cities. Like, bats with that trait were a bigger proportion of the population. And then their reproductive trait, I don't really see how it's reproductive, like having a generalized roosting strategy over, requiring a specific cave or a specific vegetation was also favored intuitively. So I'm not going to walk through, like, all of these in the same way, but for bees, they didn't actually find much that was predictive. The one thing was their reproductive trait, like solitary bees did better than social bees. Carabids, beetles, everything mattered. It was good to be small, whereas for a bat it's good to be big, for a beetle it's good to be small, and so on. I'm not going to belabor every one of these, but kind of the take home was that different groups of organisms tended to have, like, there's no one way to be urban. There are clearly patterns within groups, within bats, within lizards it's good to be small, but it's not universal. And interestingly, some of the things that, like, thermal biologists like me think should be most predictive, like some of those physiological traits, aren't even, widely enough measured to be tested in this kind of analysis yet. So we're starting to see some patterns of, like, what makes an urban species, but there's also still, like, more work ongoing. So we saw examples then, cities reduce biodiversity, they admit species with certain traits, but not necessarily not the same traits for all the groups of organisms. And then the other thing is if you do make it past the trait filter and can live in a city, that urban environment can kind of work on your populations and maybe tweak your traits to be better adapted to the urban areas, or affect your evolution in other non-adaptive ways. And you had a reading on this too, this article in Knowable magazine that talked about how species adapt to survive in cities. And we'll talk just briefly about kind of the two major divisions in evolution, where there's non-adaptive evolution. So just we're defining evolution as some change in the allele frequency, kind of the genetic makeup of a population from one generation to the next. Usually we think of that as like natural selection, acting upon traits to make an organism or a population better suited to its environment. But non-adaptive evolution isn't doing that. It's just changes in allele frequency without a fitness benefit. It doesn't make them better able to reproduce in that environment. Whereas adaptive evolution are the changes in allele frequency that cause trait changes that are better suited to the environment. And in terms of non-adaptive evolution, we do very often see loss of genetic diversity in urban populations. This is a symptom of populations being kind of small and isolated, being sort of stuck in a little park and not being able to disperse freely across the landscape and mate with individuals from other populations. So a few years ago, there was a review of 167 comparisons of genetic diversity in urban versus rural populations across a variety of species. And on average, they were finding sort of 13% lower genetic diversity in urban populations than non-urban populations of the same species. But it wasn't universal. About 62% of the species in the analysis did have lower genetic diversity in urban areas, contributing to that overall average. But some had no effect at all, only 6% of them. And then a third had higher genetic diversity in urban areas. Things like the great tit bird in Barcelona, things like black widow spiders in Arizona, seem to somehow be dispersing among cities, and cities acting sort of as melting pots for different populations and ending up boosting genetic diversity. So there's a variety of kind of patterns of how non-adaptive evolution can happen in cities, and when we talked about sort of populations having lower genetic diversity in previously redlined areas, that's this going on, the lower urban diversity due to sort of small isolated populations, genetic drift. And that's if you're an organism that's, if you want a species to survive, you don't want low genetic diversity. You want the high genetic diversity potential, sort of in the population to cope with different conditions, especially as, climate changes and other aspects of the environment change. So we see some evidence of non-adaptive evolution. There's also starting to be more and more examples of adaptive evolution, where species are actually adapting to urban conditions. One of my favorite examples of this, and one that's one of the sort of best supported examples, there are a lot of kind of circumstantial ones, this one holds up well, is whether acorn ants are adapted to urban warming. So we saw with our bees in Raleigh that you had to have a high heat tolerance to do well in the city. And the question here is, okay, acorn ants made it into the city. Do urban acorn ants actually become more heat tolerant than their rural counterparts? And to find this out, researchers, actually an NC State alum, former postdoc, did this in Ohio and collected these acorn ants. The entire colony lives in one little acorn, collected them from urban areas and from non-urban areas, brought them in the lab, kind of let a new generation of workers develop. So they had only experienced the lab environment. And those workers were reared either in a cool lab environment that simulated sort of the non-urban conditions, or a warm environment in the lab that simulated the urban conditions. And they saw kind of two big effects. So the blue dots are the ants that came from rural environments. This is their heat tolerance. So you take a rural ant and you put it in a warmer place, that population does become more heat tolerant. Same thing goes with urban ants. You rear them in the cool lab, they are less heat tolerant than if you rear them in the hot lab. But regardless of what temperature you put them in the lab, the urban ants have a higher heat tolerance than the rural ants. So there is a genetic difference between them, the fact that they were reared out in the same environment and still have this difference in heat tolerance. strongly suggests that it's an evolved genetic difference, not just an individual ant sort of acclimating to a warmer condition.
So that's adaptive evolution.
Yes. And they haven't fully shown that yet. I haven't given you the slide where they show that it's actually better to have a high heat tolerance as an urban ant. They also looked at cold tolerance and found a similar result. It looks flipped because the harder your condition is to have a lower cold tolerance. Urban ants had a higher cold tolerance. They were less able to deal with the colder, lower temperatures. And then this is the part where not only, so those sort of parts of the experiment showed that it was a genetically based difference because you could take the two populations, put them in the same environment, and still keep the trait difference. Is that trait difference actually better in an urban environment? And to get at this, they did a reciprocal transplant experiment where they collected a bunch more little acorns, and they took rural acorns into the urban environment and then moved some other rural acorns around in the rural environment. And then they took urban acorns and moved them to the rural environment and then did the reverse as well, kept urban acorns in the urban environment and tracked the survival of the ants inside for over 2 years. They put up little like aluminum flashing pens so they could keep track of their little ant colonies. And this is showing the survival of those colonies. So in the rural environment, the rural ants are surviving way better than the urban ants, which did terribly in the rural environment. In the urban environment, the urban ants had a higher survival, the rural ants had a lower survival. So this is where they're showing that these populations are also actually adapted. They do better in the conditions of their origin. So urbanization is, and there are other examples that obviously we're not going to talk about all of them, but you saw a bunch in your reading. One question that often comes up is like, okay, we're seeing these little differences in heat tolerance within a species. Does urbanization ever spin out whole new species? And if you've heard anything about it, you've probably heard about the London Underground mosquito, which for many years has been sort of held up as the example of urban evolution. I'm going to debunk it, so hold on. But this, it's still getting mentioned like in sort of urban evolution review papers, and it's kind of based on wishful thinking at this point. But this is a mosquito. It lives in subway tunnels in London, which opened in the 1860s. So if it is a species that evolved in London, it is that young, evolved since the 1860s. And it's distinct from the London above ground mosquitoes because it bites humans. It doesn't need a blood meal to actually be able to lay eggs. And it doesn't go into sort of a diapause hibernation type state. It's just active year round. And all of those sort of things are different from the above ground mosquitoes, just, above the tunnel. And some work in the 90s did some genetic analyses of the underground and above ground populations of mosquitoes and showed that they were genetically distinct, and showed that if they tried to sort of breed above and below ground mosquitoes with each other, it was not successful, but above could mate and below could mate. So it looked like pretty tempting. Like, here's an example of a genetically differentiated populations that have different traits that can't interbreed. Clearly they're species. But kind of where did the underground mosquitoes come from? Like, the one story is like, oh, they came from above ground and evolved. The other possibility is just they got introduced from somewhere else. Like, these mosquitoes are in the genus Culex pipiens, which has been a messy species complex bothering taxonomists for decades. And a study of their, nope, I don't want to talk about that one right now. Then in 2004, like, the older study had used kind of some older genetic markers, and then a 2004 study used microsatellite markers, which are now also kind of older genetic markers, but better than the Alzheimer's. And this study was actually trying to sort of figure out the origin of mosquitoes that were transmitting West Nile virus in the US, and they collected mosquitoes from all over the world and sort of made a big family tree of them. And the London Underground mosquito mapped out here, kind of on the same branch, all of the European underground mosquitoes mapped out on the same branch with mosquitoes from Spain, Japan, Jordan, Australia. I don't remember what that one was doing there. Whereas the London above ground mosquitoes, where did they end up on the tree? Do I have it? I don't have it on the slide. They're on a different branch over here. So, point being, like, they were not closely related. They were not each other's closest relative, which is what you'd expect if the above ground mosquito went underground and then evolved. They should be real close sister species, and instead they're on totally different branches of the Culex pipiens family tree. So it suggests they were already a separate species when they entered the underground, but they had just moved in from a different part of the world. So much for urban speciation. It's still a super interesting case of, mosquitoes living in the underground, but probably not urban speciation. We do have a uniquely urban species, but it came about in a totally different way. So this little plant, Senecio cambrensis, sort of evolved in Scotland and in Wales since the 1940s, independently in both places, but it evolved not the way that's fun to think about. These plants hybridize the native Senecio vulgaris and the introduced Senecio squalidus, brought together in cities, were able to hybridize and produce this new species. It kind of goes through, they also go through a change in chromosome number. And so they end up with this Senecio cambrensis having 6 sets of chromosomes, can no longer interbreed with either parent, only with other hybrids like itself, which then sort of checks the box for the definition of species. This could happen anywhere. It doesn't have to happen in cities, but at least in this case, it probably was encouraged by, the urban situation of, having this native species and this introduced species growing right next to each other in kind of, a heterogeneous urban environment that maybe offered sort of a niche for this new hybrid that it could get a toehold separately from either parent, maybe under slightly different conditions.
But does that hybrid feed a species a native species that would go to either of the parents?
Oh, does any caterpillar eat it or bee
Right,
collect
does
the
anything,
pollen?
can anything?
That's a great question. I have not seen anything about its biotic interactions.
Oh, okay.
I reckon somebody must be pollinating it. Usually the Asteraceae have bees all over them. But yeah, I don't know who's eating the leaves. That would be interesting. So I think this was it for kind of my little biodiversity section. We saw cities reduce it, sort of shift the trait distribution of the species that live in the city versus not in the city. Yes?
Yep, so granted that the city's ecology is messed up. Bottom line, is it better for humanity to congregate in cities and kind of write them off, or for all of those people to spread out across vast?
Yeah, we are hopefully going to get to that. It's definitely better for us to be congregated because of that sort of economy of scale. It was in one of your readings, like that older New York reading that somebody brought up. But yeah, we are far more efficient when we're aggregated. We use less energy, we use less fuel. And yeah, we're still, importing stuff from far and wide to support ourselves. And then as far as the perspective of how does the rest of biodiversity feel that, I'm talking about resource use, we're definitely more efficient when we're congregated. And then there's also that question of kind of density versus sprawl and its effects on other species. And for agriculture, it's super clear that you want compact agriculture and preserve natural areas, not sprawling biodiversity friendly farms. For cities, it's actually a little bit less clear because there are a lot of species that kind of do well in the sprawly suburbs, but some that absolutely can't. So the optimum configuration kind of depends on what you put into your priorities, whether it's energy and resource use, which species you want to prioritize, or how many. So it's, yeah. Yes.
I forget exactly which article it was that we read, but it took the city and then it had a much larger circle outside of it because those are all the resources that have to support the city, so it would be the agriculture that's needed.
Yep.
So instead of looking, when we look at this and we look at the efficiency of the city, again, isn't it really important not to just look at the city itself, but to look at that larger circle that has the resources that are needed for?
Yeah, it is, and we might get to that and the if you're thinking of like that Vancouver urban footprint study, that might have been one of the links or articles I suggested. For them, actually, the biggest chunk of like the non-urban land, I think like the city needed maybe 30 sometimes more area than what it actually had to meet all of the sort of supply and demand for the people in it. But the biggest chunk of that land was the carbon sink land. Like the trees needed to soak up all of the emissions being produced by the urban population, which I think is still kind of an argument for density, like more efficient living, like less transportation, less heating and cooling costs. And yeah, the agriculture still has to come in, but that's fairly independent of the density. Like you're still gonna need that amount of food, but you can shift your emissions. Yeah. All right. Oh, now it's time for the break. Just kidding. We're gonna keep going. Oh, and we're actually getting to the urban footprint stuff. So yay. So as in the reading that y'all brought up, a couple of the readings brought up this idea of kind of an urban ecological footprint and how urbanization affects our resource use. And the definition of the footprint is just the amount of non-urban land that the city relies on to produce its inputs, like the food and the water that it needs, and materials, and to absorb its outputs, the sewage and the wastewater and the carbon emissions. And this idea kind of originated in the late 1970s, actually came from economy rather than from ecology, but ecology kind of adopted it. The initial inspiration, this thinking was going on at the same time that the Biosphere 2 was being planned. It wasn't actually built until later, but people were thinking about like, what would it take to have a perfectly self-sustaining kind of equilibrium environment for people to live in, which also brought up the question, if you have a city and you wanted to put a glass dome over it, like how big would that dome actually have to be? It would have to be a lot bigger than the city, but how big? How much land is an urban population really drawing upon? And so this process kind of compares, to put it all in perspective, then calculates for the total amount of biologically productive land on the planet. How many acres do we have per person? And then how does that compare to what any given city is requiring per person? And so to come up with the sort of estimate of biologically productive land and water, it's just the estimated area that actually supports photosynthetic activity, the accumulation of biomass that people use, so fish, crops, forests, not like deserts are not included in this, ice caps are not included in this. And so then you divide that total productive area by the population, and of course the area per person is shrinking as our population grows. In 2023, we were at about 8.1 billion people, and we had 1.5 hectares per person available on the planet on average. And then as an example of kind of this footprint process, Vancouver is one city that did a quite thorough footprint analysis. They started it in like the early 2000s. And it was actually like the city asked for its footprint to be calculated. They worked with some sort of academic ecologists and environmental sciences to like get to commission this footprint analysis, because they had the goal of being like the greenest city ever, and they wanted to know what their footprint was and to set a goal for shrinking it. And so they gathered a ton of data, and this is always like the shaky step for a footprint analysis, to try and figure out like how much air pollution does your city actually produce, how much solid waste. So they got data from the city itself, from the transit authority, from the province of British Columbia and its utilities, and then some things like the amount of food. They just sort of downscaled the Canadian average of total amount of food used per person and multiplied that by the population of Vancouver. And then they estimated, another shaky step, how much land area does it actually take to produce all of the materials needed and to absorb all of the wastes produced. Which for that they used sort of FAO data for just global average yields to estimate how much land area they needed for crops. They assumed that an area of biologically productive land and water can soak up 1 ton of CO2 per hectare per year. They did a whole bunch of calculations that we're not going to talk through, but ultimately their estimate was that each person in Vancouver was using, sort of accounting for 4.75 hectares, or 11.7 acres per person of biologically productive land, which was, at the time, 2.5 times more than the actual global average available per person. So, you know, somewhere on the planet, people are using much less than that, and in other places, they're using more. And this was 36 times the actual land area within the city limits.
Wow.
So, and then I don't know if this figure was in any of the readings, but it's just kind of another visualization of the data. It's kind of easier to read from the bottom up. So they, you know, estimated per person, they needed 2.13 whatevers, I don't remember the units of food, and then translated that into land area for crops, and then some forest land area would be used for food, some pasture land area, and some water for fishing. So like the total amount of land for food sort of pipes up to then the land estimate. And then the biggest chunk here is the carbon sink required to soak up the energy that is embodied in buildings and produced by buildings. Yes.
So how does the math work on that? It seems to me if that's accurate, then we would be in global famine. So is it just that the Vancouverites are gluttonous?
I mean, it's Western developed nations have a much higher footprint than a lot of the developed world, where most of the world, you know, the largest share of the world population still is. As developing countries get more developed and adopt more of kind of the lifestyle strategies that we've got here, like, there's gonna be a problem. Like, we're carrying capacity is not great. So yeah, we're still, it's somehow pulling it off right now, but it's not a sustainable rate of land use. Which Vancouver recognized and set goals to cut their footprint by 2020. They wanted to reduce it by, I think their goal was to get it down to 1, which would not, you know, wasn't reasonable, but it was a good shot. And to try and aim for that, they implemented new programs like to recycle their construction materials to sort of reduce the embodied energy in buildings. Anytime they needed to replace a fleet vehicle, they got an electric one instead of a fossil fuel burning one. Hopefully they also have renewable sources to charge those from, but at least that's a possibility when it's electric. They actually reduced the amount of parking downtown and replaced parking with bike lanes, kind of a controversial decision. They also had participatory neighborhood footprint programs where they actually had neighborhoods, people in neighborhoods track their own footprints with the best data they could come up with, weigh their trash, do all the things. And as participating in that, they, in the first couple of years, reduced the footprint of those neighborhoods by about 12%, just so by sort of being conscious of it and keeping track of it. Whether that could stay as a long-term change when they were not still like in the program is a question. And as a result of this, they dropped their citywide greenhouse gas production 7% from 2007 to 2017. So they did reduce it even as their population grew, so it was actually an 18% reduction per capita. But their goal was to reduce it 33%. It was not to get it all the way to 1. But they still didn't make it, even with that more reasonable than I said goal. Their overall footprint shrunk from 4.27 to 3.4 hectares per person. So it got better. It was a 20% reduction. But even like with all this effort, they didn't make it. And this is a city that has, a reputation for trying really hard and wanting to be the greenest city. And they've now replaced that with, they're now in a sort of their climate emergency action plan, and they're still making an effort. But overall, so that's one example of kind of an urban footprint analysis. I have not seen one for our area. There was an effort several years ago to do like an urban metabolism analysis for the triangle, which is like a step on the way. Then you have to take the metabolism and estimate the land area required. But it was mostly relying on national or state level data and just scaling it to the triangle population. So it didn't feel very informative to like us, to anything about our scaling or how efficient or inefficient we might be relative to urban areas that have a different structure or a different economy. And that was the last thing I've seen sort of locally, but it would be interesting to know. In general, it's an approach that is possibly growing. It is like nice because it's intuitive and visualizable. They're putting everything in sort of terms of land area, and kind of intuitively illustrates those, like, the links between cities and the ecosystems that surround them well beyond their borders. In this example and some others, we see that carbon emissions are often the biggest piece of the footprint, which then suggests that if a city wants to reduce its footprint, carbon emissions are a good place to target. And on average, urban residents are using way more land than their city actually contains, and possibly more than is available on average on the planet. And it can actually be useful as a metric, like we saw in Vancouver, to set targets, to set goals, and to inspire community action. There are, like I said, always a bunch of issues with having data availability, having those data be accurate and convincing and sort of like locally relevant. And depending on where your data are coming from, it may or may not account for those efficiencies of scale. Like if Manhattan computes a footprint based on the average New York consumption rates, it's not really going to capture the difference that it actually comes from living in a dense urban area. And then there's always the trouble of trying to assume trying to figure out how many hectares of land are needed for multiple functions. They're often calculated assuming that this hectare is for carbon sequestration, but it doesn't make any food. And this hectare is for food, but it doesn't absorb any wastewater. And so trying to figure out a realistic accounting is always hard. So that is just one way of looking at sort of how cities interact with the rest of the planet beyond them. Yes?
Haven't multiple studies, though, including I think one by the UN, shown that if Western nations just switched to a vegetarian diet, that we could basically just fix all of the, get to the
or stop
goal?
throwing away food.
Right.
Either of those things would make a huge difference.
Yeah. Is that correct? That it would basically get us to the goals?
I don't know, I can't verify the numbers, that sounds right. I haven't looked at the numbers lately. I'm sure it would go a very long ways. It would at least, but I feel like it would move the intercept, right? It would get us back down to a sustainable level now, but if the population continues to grow, we're gonna be back in the same place, in 20 years or something. It would be yes.
But unfortunately, we have a tail wagging the dog situation as far as asking people to consider the possibility of adding one different thing to their diet. And somehow people take that personally.
So we wait for the economy to do it for us, which is going to be much more painful. Last-ish topic, thinking about how all of this then affects us as organisms. We looked at kind of some of the effects on other organisms. For us, there are lots of ways that cities can affect our health and well-being. We're only going to look at one of them that I just sort of arbitrarily picked because I think it's interesting. And this is how cities are changing the rates of infectious disease and immune disorders in developed countries. And so this little graph, even if you can't read it, the thing to know is all of the lines are going down that way. As we progress through time from 1950 to 2000, the incidence of infectious diseases like rheumatic fever, hepatitis A, mumps, tuberculosis are all declining. At the same time, we're seeing increasing rates of immune system malfunctions, things like asthma, type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and Crohn's disease. The incidence is all increasing. These axes are not directly comparable to each other. They're scaled in a really weird way. But the point is that the incidence is increasing pretty quickly over recent decades, and especially in developed countries. And so that data set was not uniquely urban, but it does represent sort of countries where the vast majority of the population has been urban throughout the sort of time scale there. And we don't see.
Why does the diabetes line do that?
I have no idea.
Oh, you mean that
why is it so zigzaggy? That's a great question.
Yeah.
Don't know. I would have to go dig into it because there's a lot of zigzagging, and I'm not sure if some of it,
Probably has to do with testing, you know.
testing, or I also wonder about the way that it's scaled. Like both of these are scaled so that like the rarest disease at the beginning of the axis is scaled to 100, and then everything else is relative to that. So like if diagnoses of multiple sclerosis fluctuated, it might make something else look more zigzag. I don't know. That's
Who made this chart? Because this is really compelling.
This was published in an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences several years ago, which shame on me for not having the reference on the slide, but I think that they got it from somewhere else. I think they cited a different source. But the article that had it, man, I did not put the
Because
reference
there's so
on the
many
slide.
things that could feed into that.
Yeah.
Increased anxiety could feed into it.
Yeah.
You know, tuberculosis resistance could feed into it.
Yeah.
There's the, you know, the plastics in our food, you know,
Yeah, hard to pinpoint.
the
when it's
real
all
or
changing at
imagined
once. Yeah.
diseases like, don't get me started on whatever Morgellons disease is.
Yeah.
You know, where people
Nightmare.
imagine
Yeah,
that they had
the
like plastic.
delusionary parasitosis it used
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
called.
right. But that, whatever, who knows what that is, but the emotional and mental effect it could have on a person
Yeah.
could trigger Crohn's or IBS like that.
Yeah. And then, like, the environment itself has emotional and mental effects on people that we're
Yes.
just not going to talk about today because I can pick something, but yeah,
Yeah.
So as far as infectious disease and why those lines were going down, there's some pretty clear explanations for that. Like up until the early 1900s, cities were more of a population sink for humans than a source. Their populations were growing, but because people were migrating into them to seek sort of jobs, economic opportunities, but the death rate was awful. So the cities were replenished from outside, mostly due to their high density, their poor sanitation. Cities didn't start building like sewer systems until fairly late in the game. Chicago got one in like 1895, almost 1900. So there was like poop everywhere, and it was getting in the drinking water.
And also milk wasn't regulated until, God, what, the 40s, the 50s? So people were getting tuberculosis and polio from, you know.
Yeah, and we didn't have vaccines for most of
Yeah.
that stuff. And this is just mostly a decoration of the slide, but this is a map from the sort of the famous cholera study well, not study really, but I guess it was a study in London when there was a cholera epidemic, and the sort of father of public health like mapped out where the cholera cases were occurring and sort of found them centering on this one well, and they took the handle off the well and everybody lived happily ever after. It didn't really work out quite that way, but anyway, it's kind of a turning point in the thinking about urban public health. And after that, not necessarily entirely because of that, but it still feels like a turning point, cities started to move toward cleaner water, sewage removal, keeping sewage out of the water, which was the problem that caused that, the cholera epidemic. Vaccination and antibiotics picked up, so all of this reduced the infectious diseases that people were transmitting in crowded cities. So that explains that side of the graph pretty well. Like not all of the, the bumps and zigzags, but the overall decline. Then what's going on over here? And the initial explanation, the sort of first attempt, was the so-called hygiene hypothesis, which was proposed in the 1970s, hung around until the 80s, which kind of said the left side causes the right side. Like increasing incidence of autoimmune and allergic diseases was because we weren't getting infectious diseases anymore, and as a result of that, our immune systems weren't working right, and they were starting to attack our own bodies. And people were, sort of epidemiologists were starting to accumulate evidence that might have suggested this. They were finding sort of high incidence of autoimmune disorders in, like this was a study in Canada, in sort of white urban Canadians versus indigenous communities in the same region that were living outside of the city, where they were finding, higher rates of like worms and chronic infections, but not autoimmune disorders. So they're like, oh, there must be a trade-off between having infectious diseases and having autoimmune diseases. this hypothesis got its name in 1989 with another epidemiological study of British children that showed that hay fever and eczema were like least likely, these autoimmune disorders were least likely among children who had older siblings. And they sort of speculated that, oh, they're sharing more germs, they're living, you know, they have more infectious diseases, so they're not getting autoimmune disorders. But it didn't really hold up as evidence continued to accumulate. Some studies even found the exact opposite. There was a cohort study in Denmark that kind of showed the exact opposite from what you would expect, that actually babies who got an infectious disease in their first like 6 months or so were more likely to have an allergic disease later in life. So it didn't really fit the hygiene hypothesis, but everybody kind of agreed that the risk was lower when you had pets, when you had siblings, or when you lived outside of the city, risk for autoimmune disorders. And so a new idea was proposed in the early 2000s that might reconcile some of these observations. And they said, yeah, it still has to do with our exposure to microbes, but it's not the crowd diseases, it's not the infectious diseases that are making the difference. It's like everything else, all those sort of benign microbes in the environment that we're not exposed to anymore because we're living in the city, that our immune system needs to interact with those early in life in order to work right. Sort of, and building on the idea that humans are ecosystems where the microbes that live in us and on us, we should think of them even as an organ that's as essential to our health as, you know, any sort of native organ in our body. Because the cells of microbes in and on our bodies outnumber our own cells, like 10 to 1. Their genes outnumber ours 150 to 1, and they can account for up to 3% of our body weight.
Wow.
So what about all of these other microbes that are not causing diseases, but might also be getting sort of knocked out in the same processes that are reducing infectious disease? And if that's the case, like the other thing that kind of feeds into this hypothesis is that the immune system is not just there to eliminate pathogens, it has sort of like a mirror job of tolerating the self and to tolerate benign and unbeatable organisms, these like non-disease causing organisms. If it's not interacting with the non-disease causing organisms, does it also fail to learn the self correctly? There's a particular kind of T cell that's been identified that seems to perform these functions that, you know, whereas many of our sort of memory immune cells keep a memory of the disease organisms, there are others that learn, that sort of keep that signature of harmless cells that remember what not to attack, and they actually stop the inflammatory or immune response. So if those aren't getting trained properly, is that what's behind the increase in autoimmune diseases? So overall, this new, like the old friends hypothesis, I've also seen it called the biodiversity hypothesis, which is the most ungoogleable name ever. But overall, its premise is that exposure to low microbial diversity causes sort of malfunction in the immune system and is the cause of the increase in autoimmune and allergic disorders. And evidence for this has been accumulating. We're not going to look at as many studies as I normally use in class, but in general, we're seeing this in a city, especially in Finland. Like for whatever reason, Finland just like keeps doing studies that are super interesting about like the microbiome and immune function. And there they've been finding this correlation between rural living and having high microbial diversity, especially on your skin, and having lower rates of immune and allergic disorders compared to more urban populations that then they find lower microbial diversity on the skin and higher rates of immune disorders. This has been messed with experimentally a little bit in some study organisms, that if they're reared sort of indoors versus outdoors, they find differences in the microbiome and the corresponding immune functions. And then there's actually, it's moved into some really interesting human experiments, which I'm going to come right back to, but even before the human experiments happened, when the study was still fairly new, several years ago, this hypothesis was put out there, and I think you had a reading related to this, you did, that a lot of this sort of benign microbial diversity in the environment is associated with soils and with plants. And we often see patterns in nature where higher plant diversity is also associated with higher sort of soil microbial diversity, environmental microbes. So there was this sort of thought piece in 2017 saying, hey, if this like low microbial diversity is really behind our immune problems. We need to go plant a bunch of diverse plants in our living, you know, in our yards, in our cities, to increase our microbial diversity and improve our immune function. There was no evidence for it at that point, but in 2020, this super interesting study in Finland came out that was done in 2 cities across 10 daycares, and they divided their 10 daycares into 3 treatment groups that had 16 to 36 kids per group, and the treatments were either they got, like, they all started out with urban playgrounds like this that had, like, basically no vegetation. The ground was either gravel or tile or pavement. And then in their treatment group, they took the playgrounds that started like that. They added turf, but they also added forest floor. Like this treatment back here that you can't see super well, like they dug up forest floor, blueberries, peat moss, like the works, the whole leaf litter, and transferred it into the playground. And then over the course of 28 days, and then they had a third group, which was kids in like sort of nature-centric daycares to begin with, who were always like part of their program was like every day they went and did something in the forest. So that was kind of their positive control group, like assuming that those kids should have all the microbial diversity they could want. Can they get the kids here to look more like those kids by adding forest floor to their playgrounds? And so they followed them for 28 days and measured the microbial diversity in the soil of the playground, on the skin of the kids. Also, they got gut microbes. I think they actually had the parents bring in fecal samples. It was a pretty involved study. And then also looked for immune markers to see if the kids had increased biodiversity and decreased inflammatory responses in this like forest floor treatment. And so before the treatment, this was the microbial diversity index on the forest floor children, the urban playground children, and then the nature-centric daycare children. So as expected, they did initially have the higher microbial diversity. Can we get this group to look more like that group? And it worked. After 28 days of playing in that stuff, their microbial diversity on their skin was also as high as that in the kids who went out into the real forest every day. Whereas that of the urban playground kids, it looked like it went down, but statistically it just stayed the same. And then at the same time, their immune markers changed. These, the forest floor kids moved toward a less inflammatory sort of immune markers in their blood samples and became more like the positive control nature daycare situation.
Wow.
So, like, amazing results. Things to note, there's no actual placebo here. There's no way to trick people into thinking that they're like not playing in a forest floor when they actually are. So it's not as controlled as some clinical trials. And also, this isn't really a sustainable option. Like, it's great for an experiment, but you can't uproot all the forest and bring it to all the playgrounds. So they also, after that, tried to see if they could just add a biodiversity powder to regular old sandboxes and get the same effect. And here, because the sandbox is a sandbox, even if it's got like some biodiversity powder in it, they added some peat moss to the others, so they did have a placebo. And they did a similar study design, measured similar outcomes, and overall found somewhat similar responses. They were weaker, and they kind of dropped off as soon as, like during the first 2 weeks, they sort of required the kids to play in the sandboxes, and then they just sort of backed off and like, you can use it if you want, you don't have to. And during the like optional phase, most of the changes that they saw kind of drifted back and didn't hold up. But overall, like this line of research is super new. Every year I have to like check and be like, what did they find this year? What's new? Because they're really kind of pushing this idea of how can we increase microbial diversity in kids, and can that actually combat our autoimmune problems? That's a slide about that. And then this was the reading that you had that kind of related to these ideas, written by Graham Rook, who is the original guy who came up with the old friends hypothesis and like really promoted it as a research topic.
Who was the father of public health in the London study?
John Snow.
John Snow?
Yep.
Cool.
Like in Game of Thrones, only I think with an H.
Exactly.
So in this section, overall we're seeing as society becomes more urban, our immune function has changed, seems to be linked to lack of exposure to environmental microbes, especially early in life. We didn't talk about that, and we still don't know the exact window of when you have to have that exposure for your adult immune system to work right. But circumstantially, it seems like it's probably pretty early, like baby stage, for it to really do everything it needs to do. And then we talked about kind of these potential microbial rewilding solutions that might help us get more plant diversity into cities to get more microbial biodiversity to sort of support our immune systems. At the same time, this article also notes this is yet another source of environmental inequities in cities. We've already talked about how vegetation cover tends to track with socioeconomic status or race, which is yet another way that the sort of socioeconomic environmental patterns in cities can play out to affect not only other organisms, but our own health in ways that we didn't even know were possible until the past decade. All right, so I think that's all of the stuff that I wanted to talk about, and then I had this kind of nebulous little section here at the end on actions and solutions, which doesn't really have new information in it. And I kind of wanted to ask you, when I was cooking up the plan, I was like, oh, you'll have to do impact projects, maybe you can think about what you're gonna do you want to do something urban, does any of this feed into ideas? I think you're kind of already all doing them, so I don't know if that's even a useful conversation to have. So, what would be useful at this point? Are there more things to discuss or have questions? Do you want 10 minutes back?
On this topic?
On anything.
I want to hear about actions and solutions.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about what urban ecologists think are the actions and solutions.
I mean, I have one crappy little slide that I made very late last night. It was just here are some of the things that have come up throughout the examples today. What are the things that we need to do to make cities more livable or more sustainable?
I'd love to see.
I mean, this is it. This is my crappy little slide on that topic. Of all of the kind of the things that have come up throughout the day, kind of the dismantling environmental racism, huge daunting thing, but clearly is one of the elements of making cities more equitable and sustainable. Increasing green space accessibility, as part of this, but also for everybody's health and to prevent extinction of experience.
May I take a picture?
Sure.
It seems to me that all of these are pretty broad, community-related topics.
Yeah.
As an individual, I mean, what is, dumb it down for me. What, is it planting a tree? Is it planting a, what?
Yeah, I don't want to be that cliche, but it kind of is planting a tree, planting plants. The vegetation is underlying so much of this, the heat and the water and the microbial diversity. Getting plants back in the system has got to be a huge part of it, and that is something that anybody can do on any amount of space.
And also,
So I think somebody in the back in the greenish shirt, I think you were next. Wait, what?
I'll hold my comments.
Oh, okay. Then I think, sorry,
I'm
you
just
next.
wondering if there was more information or research just into how urban ecology is informing and influencing urban planning and that kind of development work, and specifically in growing cities or improving. Because there's so many missed opportunities to be more in line with basic cycles of.
Yeah, and that's information I feel is so inaccessible, at least this actually, while kind of putting together ideas for this session where I'm we're gonna want to talk about solutions and whether they actually work, finding, so in some of the little solutions links that I included in your readings, there are these examples of nature-based solutions and things that cities have done, and they sound great, but they aren't really evaluated. New York City is adding millions of trees. Did that reduce its heat island? I don't know. Is somebody measuring it? I guess we'll get it from satellites eventually. But in general, and I need to get some of my other urban ecologist friends and make sure it's not just me, but I feel it's very poorly documented. Ecologists identify the problems, we suggest nature-based solutions, sometimes somebody picks them up, but then nobody evaluates them to see if they're really working and having the intended effect, or if they do, it's very rare. So we've got like all these examples of endangered species still living in cities, but like how are they doing? Are our conservation actions actually working? We're trying to plant trees to reduce heat islands. In principle they should, but like, are they? So yeah, I guess that was just a little rant, but I feel like based on what I know and the information I have access to, it's really hard to say like, this is the bomber solution, because it's not evaluated. I think you're next.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that all the individual efforts and like even citywide efforts to increase diversity, all these solutions we're talking about, those are all well and good, but like when we have huge corporations that are still just going to be like destroy, like they consume way more resources than individual humans and stuff. Like,
Could you talk a little louder? I couldn't quite hear the.
I'm just saying like individual choices, consumers, you know, ideology of like, if I just, you know, take a vegetarian lifestyle, like we're saying it's still, if everyone turned vegetarian, I think that we're still gonna have a problem. I was saying that there's a huge problem with like corporations, they consume way more resources than like all the individual humans and stuff. Yeah, there's just, I mean, we're relying on them to build our cities and, you know, all the products that they're producing, they're just gonna keep producing because they just wanna keep making more money, so we're producing all these products that are, we don't actually need, you know, so capitalism.
Bottom line. Yes.
One way that we as individuals can have an impact is by going to our local governments, going to your county government, going to your local municipality, joining resident groups like advisory boards, letting your opinion be known, educating your fellow residents on these topics, and when opportunities to make an impact come along, things like when they're doing land development code rewriting, or there's new development coming in and they have their developmental reviews, go in and let your opinion be known. Use your voice to educate your neighbors and bring them along with you, because as someone who's worked for a local municipality for a long time, residents work, you work for the residents. They help drive the changes in those land development codes, which is how you get things like increased green space.
Yep.
And habitat connectivity. Those
They
don't
have to
come
know
out
to do
and
it,
ask
so-
for it.
Yep.
Well, that's because the codes allow development, and they only need the bare minimum. Like I used to say when I reviewed plans, is that, okay, yeah, the builders met all of the requirements as per code, but that's like saying you got a D instead of an F.
Right.
You know, it's still the bare minimum.
Yeah.
So, you know, when these zoning hearings for variances and these things come up, going and letting your voice be heard does have an impact. It is taken into consideration. And maybe not for that project, but then when the next time code redevelopment comes along, they can, you know, make changes to the rules so that they can close that loophole.
That's encouraging to hear from the inside.
Chatham County, Board of Commissioners, she was at something I was at one time. She begged us to please come to the county commission meetings because so few people show up. One person speaking will have a huge influence.
And they're required by law to have a section of time set aside at all public meetings and hearings for public input.
Scott.
So, as an expert, are you generally optimistic or pessimistic about the future of human the species? Are we are going to adapt fast enough, or are we headed for extinction?
Oh, I hate this question. I mean, I feel like my reply is probably more emotional than informed, but yeah, I'm a total pessimist. I mean, I feel like I was just raised to be one. I'm like, yeah, we're on a completely
people are
unsustainable
assholes.
path,
I'm
and
sorry.
we're not like adjusting fast enough. Like, we'll probably survive it as a species, and many other species will too. Like, there will still be life on planet Earth, but I feel like there's gonna be some rough times. I hope I'm wrong, but that's.
Well, on that note, so we're gonna end capitalism and so much for the species. Thank you.